Hello everyone, this is Dr. Jenkins. Here we are for our second chapter in nutrition. And in this chapter, we're going to be talking about guidelines. In other words, a frame set for what should we be eating, how much of each nutrient, and so forth. It might seem boring, okay, I know. But we're going to make it as fun as we can. I've incorporated some true-false. The answers are at the end of the presentation. If you've already downloaded it or looked at it, you already know. All packaged food must contain a food label. I'll let you read through these. But this gives you an idea of what we're going to be talking about. What are the guidelines for what food manufacturers can put onto a food? What does the nutrition label look like? How to read it? What the serving sizes are? Okay. I know it sounds kind of boring, but we're going to do the best we can. And actually, I hope you'll find this somewhat interesting because it does gives us an outline, right? As always, you don't need to know everything. I'm going to be pointing out particularly what's in red. So make sure you're studying what I'm pointing out. You don't need to know every single thing. Okay, we're going to let Homer be our guide. Food. So we're talking about the dietary reference intakes. That makes it sound really boring. But really what we're talking about is some guidelines for what to eat and how much. So I've put in red the most important things. What I want you to get out of this is that these are guidelines issued by a legitimate scientific body. These guidelines come from research. So it's not just, we think this. It's actually research that's been conducted by a very, very large group of people. These guidelines are a basis for a healthy person. So it's not intended to fit everyone. Everybody's got different needs or whatever, but it gives us a guideline. These guidelines are updated every 5 years. The most recent, I think, was in 2016, which were past 5 years. Maybe it's not. I think it's like about 5 years. Because I was just doing this. I just updated this. You don't need to know 5 years, but it's updated fairly often. An interesting point, although it's not going to be on any quiz or exam, these guidelines, in addition to being good for just everyday people, these are used by healthcare professionals when they're trying to make a diet plan for someone, let's say, but also policymakers. So if you're looking at things like WIC for women, infant, and children and things like that, that's where these guidelines, they use that to develop their standards. Okay. We're going to be talking about these 5 things at the bottom. You can see what's starred. These are the ones that you're going to have to know. I'm going to talk about the others, but these are the 3 that are most important. You have to forgive me. I like history and I'm a nerd, but I was interested to read back a little bit. How did these things get started? Well, the first guidelines at all were released around World War II time, which actually kind of makes sense. In an effort to make sure that our soldiers were getting the proper nutrients and enough of each, they decided, the government, to start some guidelines. They were very rudimentary. So, of course, then I wanted to go down and see, now, if you're familiar, now the military has MREs, meals ready to eat, which are dehydrated and it's not a trip to your favorite restaurant, but they're reasonable. But look at what they ate back in World War II. Oh my goodness. Apparently they call this, again, this is not going to be on a test, but look at this. Oh my God. Can you imagine eating that? Sea rats is what they call them. What does that say? Meat and something. So there's the field cooker. They bury it and heat it. appetizing, right? Now, on special days in World War II, the U.S. soldiers would get K rations. I mean, don't forget your cigarettes, just a sign of the times. But I thought you'd be interested. Again, not on the test. Okay, I'm really going to try and make it as simple as I can. You're going to focus on the keywords. All right. These first two, let's outline. So the DRIs, the Dietary Reference Intakes, is a set. So the DRIs is a big set of guidelines. I listed 5 of them. We're going to start with the first 2 specific guidelines within all of the reference intakes. One of them is the Estimated Average Requirement, EAR. And then in a moment, we're going to be talking about the RDAs. And this is the one that you may have heard of already. And this is the one that you're going to have to know. But we're going to be comparing the EARs to the RDAs. I'm going to talk a little about the EARs, but we're going to focus on the RDAs. So these first 2 things are really about how much. How much of each food do we need? The estimated average requirement is a little bit, let me go back. The estimated energy average requirement are guidelines that are a little bit more specific, and they're meant to meet the needs of about 50% of individuals. And because of that, they're better for larger populations. If you want to get all fancy, we can look at a bell-shaped curve, and we can collect a lot of data about what people need in different categories, ages, genders, different types of people, and we can make an idea. You don't need to know these graphs. All I'm saying is this first recommendation, the EAR, is meant to satisfy about 50% of what people need. But that's not good enough, right? So the EARs, they were kind of the first. They set the tone. At least it was something. But the researchers realized that these guidelines were only fitting about 50% of people. So they then made the Recommended Dietary Allowance, the RDAs. And this is what I would like you to know, the first one. Basically, the researchers took that beginning EAR that met 50% of the dietary needs of people in the US and Canada, and they purposely set it higher. Because what's so bad about getting a couple extra nutrients? We're not talking about like alcohol and Oreos, but... So the purpose here is we took those beginning recommendations and we set them higher, which means that they're going to meet the dietary needs of almost everyone. So here we go. We're going to focus on the Recommended Dietary Allowances. These were set higher, meaning that, look, these guidelines about how much to eat meet 97 to 98% of individuals. And you can see at the bottom, going above the RDAs, this is purposely set higher, but if you had to pick between the 2 evils, it's much more of a problem to be deficient in a certain nutrient. Excuse me. So by setting them higher, we're going to meet the needs of most people. Okay. Right. So I wanted to talk about both the beginning ones that were first set, that was called EAR, and it met about 50% of the population. But we're going to focus on the RDAs. These took the EARs and set them higher. And because of that, these dietary recommendations for how much of certain nutrients meets 98 to 99%. And because of that, it's more commonly used. So I've included some tables. You don't need to know these, but if you're interested in some of the specific RDAs, I've given you some examples. I've taken this straight from the government website, the NIH, National Institute of Health. So here we can see some of the RDAs, and it's kind of cool because they do break it down by age. Because certainly, as we age at different points in our life, we need different things. For most of us, well, I'm not going to give away my age category, but most of you are probably going to be, the 19 to 30? So it gives you the RDAs. The way to read this chart, the RDAs are not the starred ones. So anything without a star. So let's just say I put an arrow for magnesium. How much magnesium should a female between the ages of 19 and 30 years old be taking in? 310 milligrams per day. How much calcium? Now I can look at calcium. 1,000 milligrams a day. What if I were a male? It would be the same. For males, they need a little bit more magnesium. Folks, you certainly don't need to know these specific numbers, but I would like you to know the idea, RDAs. It's a recommended amount of each nutrient, purposely set high, a little bit higher, so it can meet the needs of almost everyone. All right. Now, we've talked about two. So remember, the dietary reference intakes, these are a set of guidelines. We've talked about two included in this set of guidelines already. We talked about the EAR, but more importantly, the RDA. Well, now we're getting to our third one, which is the adequate intake. And it's not artificial intelligence in this context. This would be when we don't have enough scientific evidence to know how much of a specific nutrient, researchers basically provide an adequate intake. So it's also a suggestion of how much to ingest. So it's an estimate of how much to ingest. But of course, there are some nutrients that we don't have enough scientific evidence about. You don't need to know this one either. This was not one of the starred ones. So far, which were the starred ones? The RDAs. Just giving you the information. If we go back to this chart, this is the same chart as I just showed you for the RDAs. This shows us the adequate intakes. In this chart, the adequate intakes are starred. And remember, adequate intakes would be a recommendation or an estimate when we don't have enough scientific evidence, which is kind of interesting. If you look at the starred ones, well, fluoride might make sense. That's a micronutrient that we don't have a whole lot of information about. But even like potassium and sodium, it may not be as much information as you think. So these are starred. So let's just say we get the same. Let's say you're a female. According to the adequate intake, you need about 1,500 milligrams of sodium per day. What if you're a male in that same age category? Oh, guess what? Also 1,500. So it's still a reasonable estimate, but behind the scenes, the adequate intakes are things where we just haven't had enough scientific evidence to give as strong of a recommendation. All right, so we have talked about the EAR. We talked about the RDA. We mentioned the adequate intake. Now we're getting to the upper limit. So the two that we're going to star so far for you to know for quizzes and exams, RDA and upper limit. This makes me think of the movie Life with Eddie Murphy, The Upper Room. All right, I'm just a nerd. The upper limit, as you can see, the highest amount of a nutrient that you can bring in without harm. Believe it or not, sometimes bringing in too much can be bad. Not only bad, but toxic. We tend to be talking more here about vitamins and minerals. I mean, if you have too much protein over time, it could tax your kidneys. If you have too much fat, it could lead to clogged arteries. But this tends to relate more to vitamins and minerals, where even if you have too much at one time or too much a couple times, it can actually cause toxicity. You don't need to know any of them specifically, but again, I just gave you the information. I took this from the same website, But here we see the tolerable upper intake levels. So let me go. Of course, I'm a little bit older than this category, but I'll just pretend. Let's look at vitamin C. We're going to talk about vitamin C later this semester. A safe amount to take, to ingest, or take through a supplement for that matter, a safe amount for a female between the ages of 19 and 30 of vitamin C to bring in each day is 2,000 milligrams. Bringing in more can actually be toxic. Later in this course, I'm going to ask you to look at, there's over-the-counter things like Emergent C. Taking in more vitamin C, it's going to prevent you from getting sick. But knowing this, you're going to look at that label and you're going to see how many milligrams of vitamin C is in each little tablet, and it might surprise you. Now, people aren't keeling over dying from vitamin C toxicity. However, this is a cautionary tale because too much of that can absolutely be toxic. Whenever you look at this and you see ND, that just means not determined. You don't need to know these specifically, but you should know the definition. So far, these actually make sense. So here we are coming down to our last one. So for our dietary reference intakes, or a set of guidelines, within that, we've talked about the EAR. I'm doing it again, folks. EAR, RDA, adequate intake, upper limit. The ones that you have to know are the RDA and upper limit. And here's our last one. Our last one is going to be the acceptable macronutrient distribution range, AMDR. So the three that you need to know for this class, RDA, upper limit, and AMDR. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit, not so much to talk about a specific nutrient or a specific vitamin or mineral, but there's another second set here. And the AMDRs are going to give us a proportion of the macronutrients, carbs, fat, and proteins. We're going to explain this more in an upcoming slide. Something different about the AMDRs, it's going to give us a proportion of needed carbs, fat, and protein, but it can actually take into account someone's activity levels. Someone with high activity levels, they're going to need more calories, more carbohydrates, because they're burning more calories. A person with a low activity level will need less calories. So this can take more of that into account. All right. Let me just skip ahead once. Yeah, you're seeing the same slide twice. Sometimes I do that. Okay. Because what I first want to talk about are the AMDRs. In a minute, we're going to talk about the estimated energy requirement, but I want to first talk about the AMDRs. I know that's a long title. I feel like they need to hire a marketing team to make this sound more palatable, pun intended, because we're talking about food. But really, what are these? It's a range of carbs, fat, or protein that you need. I want you to burn these numbers into your brain. We're going to see it again and again and again. So these are represented by percentages. What this means is every day, for almost everybody, they need to bring in 45 to 65% of their calories through carbohydrates. Most people need to bring in somewhere between 20 and 35% of their total calories through fat, and then 10 to 35% of their total calories through protein. My cat just said hello. Memorize, memorize, memorize. Why are these given as ranges? Because that gives us room based on activity level. Folks, you need to understand these percentages. Oh my God, I can't say it enough. We're going to come back to it again and again and again. As you can see, what do we need the most of? Carbohydrates. In many instances, we need the second most fat and third most protein. These are a little bit similar, but by and large, what do we need the most of? Carbohydrates. I understand society now is carbophobic. Carbs are bad. Folks, we need carbs. They're a main energy source. We're going to have chapters coming up. We have a whole chapter about just carbohydrates, a whole chapter just about fat, a whole chapter just about protein. I'm not going to talk much more about this. But this is how our body is designed. We need the most carbohydrates. No ifs, ands, or buts. Okay. So again, I went to the NIH website, and guess what? Acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges. What are we talking about? AMDRs. You don't need to know the fancy name, but what are we talking about? The percentages of carbs, fat, and protein you need per day. We don't need to worry about the specific fats right now. These are the same percentages I had before. For adults, we need 45 to 65% of carbohydrates, 20 to 35% of our calories from fat, 10 to 35% of our calories from protein. Now, here are some examples. Remember, these are percentages. A marathon runner, well, obviously they need more carbs. Carbs give us energy. So in that range, if you remember, what's the range of carbohydrates? 45 to 65%. They're going to be on the higher end. Homer, laying on the couch, doesn't need as many carbs. Okay, so you can see how these would change. And everybody's different. There's not necessarily one right number. Bodies are a little bit different in how they process nutrients. I get it. But these percentages, that range, is going to fit almost everybody. Okay, more examples. A diabetic, they need to make sure they limit their sugar intake. And they may benefit from a higher fat diet in certain ways. So they're going to have lower sugar. A weightlifter, they need more carbohydrates because for energy, but they're not exercising for as long in duration as a marathon runner. But because their exercises are at such a high intensity, they're going to need more protein. These are all things that we're going to consider as we continue on in this course. But what's not going to change are these recommended percentages for carbohydrates, fat, and protein. Okay? All right. Yes, my cat has... I know, Kima. The students are going to memorize these percentages and are going to get A's on their quizzes. So because these are governmental set guidelines, there's all sorts of calculators out there. Okay, so I just gave you some links. If you want to actually go on there, you can put in some of your personal information, age, height, weight, and they can spit out some recommendations for you. So later in this chapter, we're going to be looking at nutrition labels. So as a little preview, let's just have a quick look. Do the DRIs that we just looked at, do they relate to the nutrition labels? What we're going to see is nutrition labels here in the United States are based off of percent daily value. Now this is different terminology than RDAs. Again, they could use some marketing people. But let's keep it simple. The percent daily values, that's what you're going to see on a nutrition label. They're based on the RDAs. So they're not quite the same, but they're based on it. So these things written on the nutrition label, even though it's packaged a little bit differently and it says percent daily value, they're based off the RDAs. So they are related to these overall guidelines. It's not exactly the same. The percent daily values are not exactly the same as the RDA, but it's based on them. And the reason they did this, and it should make sense to you, is because the RDAs are specific to each nutrient. Where you have each nutrient, sometimes it's in grams, the recommended dietary allowance, RDA. Sometimes it's in milligrams. it would be very difficult. It would make our nutrition label much lengthier. So it kind of makes sense that we have a little different way because it does it by percentages, which means that we can more easily show that. All right. A few reminders before we switch gears. These sets of guidelines are for healthy people and often need to be adjusted. And also, I really hope you get this theme as we continue with this course. Nobody's perfect. So one day you might have a little more of a certain nutrient than the RDA, one day a little bit less, right? But what we would want to hope for is that over a long period of time, over weeks, months, years, are you averaging out to meet these guidelines? Yes, I might have more protein on one day and less on the other, but overall, over the course of a year, over the course of months, am I getting somewhere between 10 and 35% of my calories from protein? Then I'm good. Okay. So now that we know some of these, how do we apply them? Let's talk about my plate. Okay. So the first thing we did were the DRIs, dietary reference intakes. That was a set of guidelines, RDAs, how much of each nutrient to bring in, upper limit, how much of a vitamin or mineral we can have before it's harmful and toxic. And then we talked about the AMDRs, a percentage range for carbs, fat, and protein that we should have from our calories each day. So the government, and it's educationally sound, we try and present this in ways that make it easier to understand. Okay. So again, the government uses different words. Dietary guidelines for America. We're going to focus more on my plate, but these are basically like visual representations and ways to understand how. Right? We're talking about how do we use and apply them. Yes, I can look on a graph and say I need this many milligrams of sodium, but how can we actually put them into use? And that's what these dietary guidelines and my plate are. They're also updated often. They're also designed for healthy individuals. They're also set by governmental agencies. Okay. There's two sets, the dietary guidelines for America. The newest ones, 2020, 2025, these are guidelines based on research, blah, 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 blah. And then we're going to talk about my plate. These dietary guidelines, we're not going to get too specific on this because it's common sense. I think it's just another way to try and get across what healthy eating is so we can fuel our body properly. So the dietary guidelines for America tell us that we need to make sure that we have healthy eating over every life stage. These food choices need to reflect our preferences, our culture, our budget. We should have more nutrient-dense foods, staying within the calorie limit. We should limit certain things that might not be too good. Like it's okay to have once in a while, but we should limit them. So they're pretty common sense, okay? But these do change over time. Hold on for 1 second. Okay. So you don't need to know. I know they're in red. I'm not going to ask you these specifics. Like you don't need to know. I'm not going to ask you to list them. Hold on for 1 minute. Come on. Doing things at home, my cat gets in the way. So you don't need to know the specifics, but I would like you to know what they are. Dietary guidelines for America are guidelines put out by the government to help us eat healthy. How about that for a quick and dirty way? Dietary guidelines put out by the government to help us eat healthy. I give you some resources here. This is the most recent schematic they have. This lists the same things we just said. have healthy eating at every life stage, customize it based on your preferences, culture, and budget, nutrient-dense foods, and limit things. Okay. But of course, what you might be more familiar with is My Plate. So we're going to talk about this, and then we will end this first video, and I'm going to record a second one to break it up a little. So My Plate is a visual representation. It used to be the 4 food groups. Then we had the food guide pyramid. So it's gone through many iterations. Maybe you've seen some of these before. Here's our newest one. All right. Our newest one is My Plate. There it is, folks. Again, it just gives us kind of a roadmap. Without guidelines, then it's kind of the wild, wild west. We know we're not going to meet them every day perfectly. That would be boring. But it gives us some sort of roadmap to remember and hopefully over the course of time, stick with. So My Plate tells us that half of each plate, meaning half of each meal, half the plate should be fruits and veggies. So if we look here, half of our plate, fruits and veggies. I'm guessing not many people have that be true. It's hard, especially in our culture, but the message here is more fruits and vegetables. And then the other half of the plate, we have a quarter grains and a quarter protein. So I'd like you to know those first 3. Half of the plate, fruits and veggies. They don't necessarily stipulate a quarter fruits, a quarter veggies. As you can see on this picture, it would probably be best to have a little bit higher amount of vegetables compared to fruit. But half the plate, fruits and veggies. And then on the other side, a quarter grains and a quarter protein. They also tell us to have 1 serving of dairy and then add margarine or oil for food prep or at the table. It's just a roadmap. They give us more guidelines. I'm not going to ask you these. They tell us for fruits and vegetables, try and have a wide variety of color because that's going to give us the most nutrients, different nutrients. Eating the same food all the time is only going to give us certain nutrients. Limit added sugars. My Plate does talk about discretionary calories, so I would like you to know those. My Plate purposely, can you see a trend here? Because the RDAs, we purposely set things higher. My Plate also has lofty goals. Half the plate, fruits and veggies, that's a lot of veggies. They set lofty goals, meaning that if you followed it as it's meant to be followed, you're actually going to have some leftover calories because these foods are so nutrient dense with so few added calories, empty calories. So if you follow this most of the time, you're going to have some leftover calories. And that's where the fun comes in. This is where we can have some treats, sensible treats. My Plate tells us that these discretionary calories of treats should not exceed 15% of our total calorie intake. I'm not as worried about that number. Just be able to understand the idea of discretionary calories. That the My Plate guidelines are purposely lofty. If you really do follow that, you're actually going to get a lot of nutrient value in relatively few calories, leaving some leftover calories where you'll still be under your total calorie need, discretionary calories. There's also some interactive tools. There's even an app. Yes. They didn't have this, folks, even when I went to college. I'm not going to disclose how long ago that's been. I bet I graduated before most of you were born. We didn't have these. So actually, they can be really helpful, albeit overwhelming, I suppose. But you can actually go, here's the website, myplate.gov/myplate/plan. You can go in there, hit start, put in your age, gender, height, weight, activity level. It's going to spit out for you a recommended number of calories per day. There's actually some pretty good resources. I hadn't been on there in a little bit. They really upped their game. It gives you a lot of ideas. If you want some ideas for lean protein, then go there. They have some ideas. They have sample recipes. They even have specific info on dietary needs based on your age. So actually, they have recipes. I mean, actually, it's not so bad. All right. Back in the day, we had more tables and graphs. This came from an old textbook. You can even tell it's old. You don't need to know these, but it just gives you an idea. This is so old that it includes grains higher than I think our later recommendations are. But it just gives you an idea of balance, right? Okay. My Plate also gives us some other recommendations. You can read through these. I think a lot of it's common sense, but they still give those to us. Folks, I try and give you some resources. So if you're looking for ideas, because sometimes we get stuck, or it's like, oh, I just want a burger. But this might give you some ideas. Healthy fats. If we need fats, but let's make them as healthy as we can. So if you want some ideas, I just try and give you some resources. Okay, we're going to end here, and then I'm going to pick it back up for video number 2.